Good evening and welcome to the Marion Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Shannon Miller and I'm one of the 2 Ath Fellows this year. When I studied the history of environmental activism in high school, our teacher had us listen to songs from the 60s and 70s, like Joni Mitchell's Big Yellow Taxi, to hear firsthand the attitudes of the time. In a history class on women's suffrage, we looked at satirical cartoons made by suffragists that mocked arguments for denying women the vote. One of our greatest tools in studying history is to go straight to the source by looking at things that may at first seem out of place in academia, things like satire, literature, cartoons, and, as our speaker tonight will explain, comic books. Professor Christopher Conway teaches Spanish and chairs the Department of Modern Languages at the University of Texas at Arlington. And his current research focuses on Spanish language comic books, pulp fiction, and films, using cultural snapshots to understand the nuances of important historical periods. Professor Conway's upcoming book, 19th-Century Spanish America, A Cultural History, explores those themes further by presenting a panoramic and evocative telling of the leisure activities, entertainments, and values of the varied peoples of Latin America. As always, audio and visual recording are strictly prohibited. Please join me in welcoming Professor Conway to the Ath.
Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank Shannon for that lovely introduction, and I want to thank all of the students who are sitting at my table. I've had such a delightful conversation, and the conversation encapsulates everything that's been wonderful about the last 24 hours on my stay here at Claremont, McKenna. We talked about translation and how difficult it is to translate poetry. We talked about Tolstoy. We talked about people's future plans. We talked about the recent filmic adaptation of Jane Eyre. It was just a wonderful conversation, and thank you for your company and for making me feel so welcome. I also want to thank Professor Lee Skinner for helping to facilitate my visit here today, and the staff and administration at the Mary Minor Cook Athenaeum. This is by far the most beautiful venue I've ever been at as a speaker, and it's just an honor to be able to address an audience here, especially in light of the fantastic and prestigious speakers you've had in the past. I also want to thank the faculty who've taken me around. It's kind of like a job interview, but without the pressure. You know, it's like you just relax, let us show you a good time on campus. It's been wonderful. So thank you very much. Let me see if let's get started. So I want to talk a little bit about how I got into comics. And it all began back in the 1970s when I had the privilege of living in Spain for many years, and I grew up reading comic books. One of the dilemmas of my childhood was that I could not easily get access to U.S. comics in Spain. I had to wait for my older brother John to send me packages from the U.S. jam-packed with Marvel and DC comics. But I would only get those packages maybe twice a year. And after a few days, those comics would be used up, and I quickly learned how to love Spanish comics, as well as French comics like Tintin, which I read in Spanish religiously every day with breakfast, with my toast and my hot chocolate and churros. And I also read Sipi Sape, a wonderful Spanish comedic comic. And so I loved comics as a kid, like so many people, but I had troubles getting access to U.S. comics. When I became older and I came to the United States to live and go to college, I began to collect comics a little bit, and then I stopped. And then about when I was in graduate school 25 years ago, I started visiting Tijuana because I was a graduate student in San Diego, and I started picking up bagfuls of Mexican comics for about 50 cents or $1. And I loved them. And so since then, on and off, I've been collecting comics, and I've become very interested in them. I'm a scholar of the 19th century, as you heard. But now that I've finished my latest book, I said, I think it's now it's time to go back to my childhood and start thinking about comic books again. So I want to share with you a comic by one of my favorite graphic artists or comic book storytellers, Harvey Pekar, and it's from American Splendor, and it's a story called How I Quit Collecting Records and Put Out a Comic Book with the Money I Saved. And it's a great story. I really relate to this well. No matter how many records I get, I'm never satisfied. I gotta get more. I've tried to quit, but I can't. What am I gonna do? This is like being a junkie. It's so hard for anybody but another collector to understand why you can't kick the habit. And the moral of the story is, of this story, he says later on, is I finally stopped collecting records, and it was thanks to that I became a storyteller, and now look at me, I'm a successful comic book artist, and people think I'm important, so I'm hoping I'll quit soon and start writing novels. So here are two comics from my collection. I specialize in collecting comic books about Mexican history. Most of the comics that I collect are from the 1950s and 60s, although I have some that are earlier and then others from the 1960s and 70s as well. I also collect a lot of Westerns. But today I want to talk about comics in general, and I want to introduce the subject. And what I find exciting about comics, and the reason why I think I collect comics, is because in this digital age, things of beauty or images of beauty seem very intangible. They seem very immaterial because they're on the screen and they're very fleeting. And I love the materiality of comics. I love the smell of comics. My brother is a comic book collector as well. He collects Marvel, high-end, Spider-Man #1 type of comics. And he was at my house recently, and he was smelling some of my Mexican comics. I kid you not. I showed him one of these comics, and the first thing he did was stick it to his face. And he said, someone's got to make some cologne out of this. I kid you not. But there's something about that materiality of comics, the beauty of the paper, the pictures, that I think I experience a sense of nostalgia for that in this digital age. And I think that's one of the reasons why I collect comic books and also vintage movie posters and also vintage photographs and things that are, paper objects that I consider to be beautiful. So what are some of the guiding themes of today's presentation? Well, I want to talk about how Mexican comics are related to mass culture, and I want to talk about transnationalism in comics, and these are the 2 points. Let's go through them very quickly. Comics are a type of mass culture. Now, what is mass culture? Mass culture is a kind of culture that emerges in the 20th century thanks to technologies like radio, film, and television. And thanks to those vehicles and also cheap print, cultural objects can reach massive numbers of people like never before in the 19th century. So what does this mean in relation to comics? Mexican comics have been historically the most ubiquitous form of print in Mexico between the 1930s and the end of the 20th century. There's a great quote by a wonderful Mexican writer called Salvador Novo that says, "We cannot ignore the comic book. It's there. It's what the Mexican people read." And another critic from the 1940s wrote that he was worried about the popularity of comics in Mexico because more people, at the rate things were going, more people were going to be reading comics than the Bible or great works of literature like Don Quixote. And this really, the only way we can appreciate that last comment is if we think a little bit about the numbers of readers that Mexican comics had between 1930 and 1970. So let's talk a little bit about literacy rates in Mexico before we talk about how many people were reading comics. In 1910, the literacy rate in Mexico was around 20%. But it really rises meteorically up to the present, where right now it's around 98%. So by the end of the 1930s, the literacy rate is at over 40%. By 1950, the literacy rate is over 50%, around 55, 56%. And by 1970, it was 76%. So in a 50-year period, we go from a 20% literacy rate to a 75% literacy rate. And so we've got this tremendous emergence of new readers between 1930 and 1960, and comics happen to be there waiting to be discovered. And comics are an extraordinary thing for new readers because they're cheap and they're easily available. So let's talk a little bit about print runs and the massive print runs of Mexican comic books in this period, and think about this literacy rate question, because they're interrelated. In the 1940s, 4 daily comic books taken together, had a print run of 500,000 copies a day, along with 3 comic book weeklies that taken together published 1 million copies a week. Now, keep in mind a basic rule that comic book scholars talk about in the scholarship about Mexican comic books, which is that every comic book is read on average by 4 people. So when we're talking about millions of comic books circulating, one way of thinking about it is, in terms of readership, is multiplying that by 4. So according to one estimate, taking multiple readers into account, 2 million people were reading 1 comic a day in the 1930s and 40s, and another 4 million people were reading 1 comic a week. If we take into account the statistics about population size and the literacy rate, these 6 million readers account for over 80% of the people who knew how to read in that time period. Now, the math is a little bit complicated, and I've kind of distilled it down, but this is an estimate that conveys to you how extraordinarily popular these comic books were in this period. And I'll talk about why that was, and why historically people felt good about reading comics. Adults felt good about reading comics, that it wasn't a kiddie thing. It was a thing for everybody, and it was a thing that was tied to Mexican nationalism, and we'll come back to that. More recent statistics about Mexican comic book readership are interesting as well. In the 1980s, Mexico's most popular comic book, Western, had a print run of over 1 million copies a week. Okay? So we're talking about 50 million copies a year. But now, in the early 2000s, the print run was less than 400,000 a week. And a lot of that's tied into the internet. I visited a class today, and we talked a little bit about comic books in Mexico, and I said that the golden age of Mexican comic books is over. It lasted from the 1930s to around 2000. Comic book readership is down, print runs are really down, and I believe this is a function of the internet and digital culture, which makes that form of literacy more popular, or it cuts into comic book readership. So to make matters even more mind-boggling, Mexican comics circulated in Latin America. They traveled to Peru, and they were particularly popular in Argentina and Uruguay. Now, Argentina and Uruguay had historically have the highest literacy rates in all of South America. By the end of the 19th century, their literacy rate was around 75%, Argentina and Uruguay. So they're 100 years ahead of most other countries, and 100 years ahead of Mexico in terms of having most of the population knowing how to read. So their comic book culture is very strong as well. And so they're consuming a massive amount of comic books that are being produced in Mexico and that are being exported to Argentina. And also exported to other countries as well, but I want to mention Argentina and Uruguay. So mass culture. Comics reach a massive number of people. And so if we're trying to think about how common people thought, or what their values were, or the kinds of stories they enjoyed to consume, studying comic books in this time period is a really interesting way to kind of explore that question. So the second point here is transnationalism. We can't talk about Mexican comics without talking about U.S. I feel so bad. I just powered through those slides. I'm going to go back. Let me go back. I want you to enjoy some of these slides here. Okay. So we talked a little bit about mass culture. This is one of the most popular comic books in Mexico, Kaliman. We're going to talk about this guy. He's really cool, and he's a superhero. And he's saying, la estatura de los hombres se mide por el valor de sus acciones. The stature of men is measured by the bravery of their actions, or the courage of their actions. And this is a stamp from the 1930s about the literacy campaigns in which the Mexican government was promoting literacy and sending out teachers into rural communities to help them learn how to read. And so that was a cultural project that was very important in that time period. And now I love The Phantom. When I was growing up, El Fantasma by Lee Falk. He had a purple outfit. You can't appreciate it here. And then this was the Mexican Western comic book that was had print runs of over 1 million a week in the 1980s, and which now is down to the less than half that. This is from my collection and one of my favorite covers. It's also on the internet a lot, so I think a lot of people really like this issue. It's a desirable one. I have 2 copies of it. That was accidental. I bought a batch and it was mixed in there. Transnational dialogue is another characteristic of Mexican comics. And so U.S. TV shows, U.S. movies, and U.S. comic books based on TV shows and movies flooded the Mexican market in the 1940s and 1950s. And these comics are going to be very popular, and they're going to influence and inspire Mexican comic book artists. So what's interesting about this is that Mexican comic book artists would take things like the Western or Dick Tracy, and they would create hybrid or Mexicanized versions of them. And so I don't really think about this phenomenon of the influence of U.S. comics or U.S. films and TV on Mexican culture. I don't think of it only in terms of maybe the word colonialism comes to mind, cultural colonialism, or imposing something that squashes creativity or native culture, but really an opportunity for Mexican artists to respond, to react, to transform, to reinvent. And so it's a much more dynamic and rich process of dialogue instead of a situation in which this material is coming in and pushing out Mexican artists. So we'll be talking about that as well. And there's this multimedia circuit where what's happening on the radio, what's happening on TV, what's happening on film is also happening in comic books. So at the same time that Mexicans were listening to radio programs about Sherlock Holmes, they were reading a Sherlock Holmes comic strip in the newspaper that was very popular, and they were tied together. Sometimes the radio show, the scripts from the radio show would be used as a script for a comic book appearing in the newspaper, right? That was a common thing. As in this case, they would watch Lone Ranger movies and then read Lone Ranger comics. So there's this circuit where comics and film and radio and television are all in synergy together. And they're feeding off of each other. So we can't really speak about Mexican comics in isolation. We have to see it as a part of a cultural mosaic in which these different forms of mass culture are speaking to each other and informing each other. And that's one of the interesting things about studying Mexican comics, is to see these relationships. So in a lot of the Mexican comic books, and a lot of the comic books I collect, these are from my collection as well, are an opportunity for Mexican artists and script writers to explore what it means to be Mexican and to tell the story of the Mexican past. And so starting in the 1930s, the Ministry of Public Education, la Secretaría de Educación Pública, started subsidizing comic books for kids and for grown-ups that would promote patriotism, good citizenship, and awareness of the cultural past of Mexico. And this is a way to create harmony, to create a sense of belonging, to create a sense of community. There's a very famous book that that we talk about when we talk about nationalism, called Imagined Communities by Benedict Anderson, in which he argues that the nation is an imagined entity. It's a fiction that, that is created by a collectivity, and that argues that even though we come from different parts of a country and maybe from different backgrounds and different social classes, we share this intangible identity, national identity, and makes us feel connected to one another and willing to die for the nation, right? And so these comics participate in that kind of community building, that kind of imagined community. So apart from publishing comic books like these, they also published hybrids between comic books and textbooks, and I have a few of these in my collection. These are there are two ways of thinking about them. They're either comic books with too much text or textbooks with too much pictures. So take your pick. And so they have a lot of text, a lot of paragraphs, but they have a comic book style art in it. And it's this weird hybrid where they're trying to create a kind of cliff notes to talk about the Mexican Revolution or the conquest of the Aztecs, and to get students excited about it in grade school, because even though it's in school, it's educational, it's still fun because it's in color and all of that. So one of the most controversial examples of how the Mexican state has been interested and involved in sponsoring comic books is something that happened in the year 2005. In the year 2005, the Mexican government, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, decided to publish a comic book handbook for Mexicans who were thinking of crossing the border illegally, and for Mexicans who are living in the United States without proper documentation. And they titled this comic book El Guía del Migrante Mexicano, the guide for the Mexican immigrant. And this created an uproar in the United States. If you were paying attention to U.S.-Mexican relations in 2005, there were two very hot topics and controversies that, disputes that arose between the U.S. and Mexico. One of them related to this, this comic book. And the comic book tries to teach potential immigrants how to be careful, how to survive, what things to avoid, be careful with the coyotes, be careful with the criminals. And here, this panel is about the danger of crossing, crossing the river, and how this could be dangerous. And it's a way of trying to educate people. Now, this comic book was packaged with the two most popular comic books in Mexico at that time. El Libro Semanal, the weekly book, which is kind of a love story comic book, the readership of which is mainly women. And then El Libro Vaquero, you saw that cover of the Apache holding the blonde woman. And so those two comic books were being sold throughout Mexico, and especially in the United States. They were being sold in clear plastic packages with El Guía del Migrante Mexicano inside the package. So when you bought El Libro Vaquero or El Libro Semanal and you opened the package, you would get this guide. And the Mexican government had done some studies and knew from surveys that a large number of the immigrants who were living in the United States were reading El Libro Semanal and El Libro Vaquero. And so they had picked these comic books very much on purpose to target those communities, as well as the people in northern Mexico as well. And of course, in the United States, this created an uproar because as far as many members of Congress were concerned, this comic book was counted as a promotion of illegal immigration and a comic that was encouraging people to cross the border illegally. And so there was a lot of debate about that. And I remember when this happened, it wasn't that long ago. And at that time, I was collecting comic books. And the first thing I did was I ran out to the panaderia, the bakery, because Mexican comic books are very easy to find in Texas. They're in supermarkets that serve the Latino community and in bakeries. So I just ran out to the bakery and to the supermarkets, and I just bought a bunch of packages. And I wish I had brought a package to share with you so that you could look at it. I wouldn't allow you to open it, but I would pass it around so that you could see. But unfortunately, I didn't bring it. So let's talk a little bit about the earliest versions of Mexican comics. So in the 19th century, we really don't have comic books in Mexico. Comic books, to be the comic arts, require sequential storytelling. They require many things. It's a complicated subject, and there's a marvelous book about it called How to Understand Comics by Scott McCloud. But the key aspect of the definition is sequential art. We do have cartoons, though, which are not sequential, and we have illustrations. And so political caricature in Mexico is a very powerful phenomenon. And we see here a caricature with the president of Mexico, Sebastián Lerdo de Tejada, giving a flower to one of my favorite authors, Ignacio Manuel Altamirano, who's someone that Professor Skinner is also really familiar with. And so this was a very common thing in the press of the 1800s in Mexico. And also in Mexico, as in the rest of Latin America, we have a movement called costumbrismo, in which Mexican writers and artists are trying to create typologies of the different kinds of people that live in cities and in their countries, and which illustrate the national specificity of their culture. And so, for example, this is from a book called The Mexicans Painted by Their Own Hand, which was inspired by some European books, The Heads of the English, which is the catalog of images of different tradesmen and tradeswomen. And it is an illustration of what they look like and how they dress, and then a paragraph describing, you know, their manner of speech and the kinds of tools they used in their job and their mannerisms and things of that nature. This also caught on in Spain, where a book called The Spaniards, Painted by Their Own Hand, appeared in the late 1830s or early 1840s, in which the same thing was being done. We have an illustration, a beautiful lithograph, and then maybe a tongue-in-cheek or a satirical description of that particular tradesperson. This became popular immediately across the ocean, and the Cubans promptly produced The Cubans Painted by Their Own Hand, and shortly thereafter the Mexicans produced The Mexicans Painted by Their Own Hand. And this is an illustration of El Aguador, the water carrier. This is how people got water in the 19th century in cities and in villages. There were aguadores, water carriers, that would come around and sell water to different people. So this is the kind of thing we have in the 19th century, but it's not until the 1920s and 1930s that comics really start to come into their own in Mexico. And we have first comic strips in newspapers, but the readership is relatively reduced. It's not until the mid-1930s that comic books or actual publications that are only comics start to appear. I like to tell my students in Texas that the first Mexican comic book happened roughly around the same time as the first US comic book. So Mexicans were not behind the curve. If anything, they were as far out there as any other country was with regards to advancing the comic arts, if not ahead of the United States. And so we have these comic book digests that appear in the 1930s, mid-1930s, and what they're made out of is, I'm totally off script now. I hope things work out fine. I'm a little bit worried. What these comic books are composed of is there'll be a 1 page of Superman, 1 page of Betty Boop, 1 page of Dick Tracy, a Mexican a comic with a Mexican detective, a satirical Mexican comic, U.S. syndicated love story, and so it's a mixture of different kinds of strips from the U.S. as well as some strips that are created in Mexico. Now, magazines like this would publish sometimes 8 days a week. They would publish, there's no such thing, it's, well, other than the Beatles song, right? 8 days a week means they would publish 1 issue a day, and then on Sunday they would publish 2 issues, and that's why I used that illogical, I said 8 days a week. And so they were publishing millions of copies a month. And the reason why this was so popular and caught on so much was because of this issue of the literacy rate exploding around the 1940s and 1950s. And Mexicans felt that, and Anne Rubinstein has written a magnificent book on the history of Mexican comic books, in which she argues, as well as other Mexican scholars as well, that it was a point of pride for the Mexican people once they learned how to read, to actually read. And they weren't getting hung up on, wait a minute, I need to read Don Quixote de la Mancha. They were saying, what's available to me as an artisan, as someone of limited means? Well, I've got access to this comic book, which is only 10 or 20 cents. I can afford that, and I can, you know, I can buy that, I can keep it, I can share it with my friends and family members, and others will do the same with me. And so there's this patriotic dimension to reading in the 1930s and 1940s, and it's not polluted by this sense of, wait a minute, I should be reading something a little bit more elite or a little bit more sophisticated. There's none of that soul-searching and weird sense of shame about comic books, but a real sense of, a real feeling of embracing this genre. So what's so exciting about these comics? Well, for Mexican readers, I love this picture of a young lady reading a comic book. What's so exciting about them? Well, they're very interactive. Readers could send in photographs, and they would publish photographs in the comic books of just normal people, of readers. Sometimes readers would send in their life stories or a particular love story, something that had happened to them, and that would be the script for a comic book that would be published. And so there was this sense of these comics relate to our daily lives, and we can be a part of this story. It's not a thing that is foreign to us and our experience, but something that we can be a part of. And another way that people felt like they could be a part of these comic books was through contests and raffles and things of that nature, which these comics, the editors of these comics were very good at doing. And so people would do things with crossword puzzles or tear things out and collect them, send them in, and then get prizes, and some fancy prizes like a television and things of that nature, or a bicycle. And so this kind of interactivity was something that made comics special. Now, these are comic book digests, meaning that they're anthologies, they're compilations. They're not the comic book that's one character for 30 or 40 or 50 pages. And these digests kind of die out in the 1950s, in the mid-1950s, and then what starts taking over and becomes the main thing are comics about one particular character. So I want to talk about 3 iconic comic book characters in Mexico. One from the 1940s, but who has endured up until the present. One from the 1960s that has endured up to the present. And then finally one from the 1970s that continues to be popular. And so I want to begin with, so here are some of those photographs I mentioned, where young ladies would send in their photographs, and there are little biographies about them. Imagine the excitement of these young ladies to see themselves in the comic book and to realize that, you know, millions of people were looking at them. And think about the excitement of all the other young ladies who were thinking, I sent in my photograph last week, maybe I'll be in next Tuesday. So let's talk about Memin Pinguin. Memin Pinguin is short for Guillermo Pingo. People in Spanish whose Guillermo is William. The nickname for William is Memo, and so Memin is basically Little William. And Pingo in Mexican Spanish is basically like a rascal. Although Pingo, Pinga in other countries does mean penis, which was an issue when they tried to market this comic in Colombia and other countries. So they kind of had to play around with that a little bit. Now, the main character in Memin Pinguin is little Memin, and his mother is Eufresina, and she is basically, well, as you can see, Memin Pinguin is basically a pickaninny. And if we think about it in terms of U.S. Representations of race, you know, what in the U.S. culture, we consider the pickaninny iconic figure to be, you know, just the embodiment of late 19th century and early 20th century racism in this country, in which African American people are created into subhuman, dwarfish, diminutive mixtures of human and animal. And this started to occur in U.S. caricatures during the the Spanish American War, excuse me, in 1895. If you look at the cartoons that were published in U.S. newspapers during the war we fought with Spain over Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, you'll notice that the people of Cuba, the Philippines, and the Caribbean in general are represented in this way as dwarfish little children that need to be disciplined and dominated by the U.S. And so we have a very strong iconography in this country of thinking about of this kind of imagery. And what's curious is in Mexico, it appears in the 1940s in one of these comic book digests in a comic strip called Alma Zanino, The Souls of Children. And Memin Pinguin is so popular that in the 1950s, the stories start to be republished and retold in comic book form without the other strips in there, right? And so he becomes his own comic book. He gets his own comic book and keeps on going. And so what were the inspirations for Memin Pinguin? There are a few different inspirations. One of the inspirations, believe it or not, is The Little Rascals, a famous series of shorts and movies from the U.S. From the 1920s and 1930s. And The Little Rascals, back in the 70s, I don't know about in the United States, but in Spain, where I grew up, they used to show that on TV. They weren't concerned about that. And the famous African-American character there is Buckwheat, as you know, and also a pickaninny character. And so some scholars believe that The Little Rascals, Our Gang, and other movies from the 20s and 30s in the U.S. that were known in Mexico as well helped to inspire the character of Memin Pinguin. Another potential inspiration is Will Eisner's The Spirit. Now, Will Eisner is credited with being the inventor of the modern graphic novel. He was a Jewish comic book artist, considered by many to be the greatest comic book artist of the 20th century. If there are any Jack Kirby fans in here, I will concede that maybe it's a tie between Jack Kirby and Will Eisner. And Will Eisner, who is from New York, created this strip called The Spirit in the late 1930s and early 1940s that was extremely popular. And The Spirit was a detective who wore a little mask, and he had a sidekick called Ebony, who looks a lot like Memin Pinguin. And the scholarship that I've looked at doesn't really talk about Will Eisner's The Spirit in relation to Memin Pinguin, but I have to tell you that I have a few Will Eisner Mexican comic books in my collection from the 1950s. And my thinking is, if he was popular enough to appear in numerous comic books in that period, perhaps his strip was known early enough, and that character of Ebony might have been one of the inspirations. And a third inspiration was also a genre of Mexican movies about street kids living in Mexico City and surviving in difficult conditions. And so there are all these mixtures, all of these influences coming together to create this image that is very disturbing to people in the US. And in 2005, this is the second controversy from 2005. In 2005, the Mexican postal system celebrated Memin Pinguin by printing stamps with pictures of Memin Pinguin. And when that happened and hit the media in the United States, there was an outcry by activists in the US and public intellectuals like Jesse Jackson and others who were very upset because President Fox of Mexico a few weeks earlier had said that when defending Mexican immigrants, had said something along the lines of, well, you know, Mexican immigrants do the jobs that even US blacks don't want to do. And that had already created controversy and upset in the United States in the African American community. And so when on the heels of that, a few weeks or a few months later, we've got the stamp coming out, well then we have another uproar. And it's really a fascinating question. And we can talk more about this maybe in the Q&A. So here are some images from Alma Zanino, the earliest version of Memin Pinguin from the 1940s. He was created by Yolanda Vargas Dulce, who is one of the greatest popular artists of 20th century Mexico. She wrote telenovelas. She wrote numerous comic books that were massively important. She is a giant. She is a true giant in the history of Mexican culture. She has not received her due because historically, we have not paid much attention to comics or treated comics as something significant or culturally important. But as that changes, her stature will grow. She also wrote film scripts and radio novels. And so she is one of the creators of Memin Pinguin, along with an artist called Alberto Cabrera. So here we've got our gang with Buckwheat. And this is one of those films that some scholars believe contributed to this atmosphere, to this strip, which is about street kids, Memin Pinguin. The adventures of Memin Pinguin is he's a poor kid, black kid on the streets of Mexico. He's got a mestizo friend, he's got a rich friend, he's got a middle-class friend, and they're just dealing with life. And it's actually a melodrama. It's not pure caricature making fun of Memin Pinguin, although there's a lot of that. He's a good-hearted little boy, but he also is suffering and witnessing the difficulties of poverty. And so it's a tearjerker. Here is the infamous, in the United States, infamous comic stamp. In Mexico, he's beloved. He is not seen as this terrible symbol. And so let's talk a little bit about Kaliman. I want to get to Kaliman because I want to give all of you some time to ask some questions if you like. Now, Kaliman first appeared in radio novels. Now, radio novels are the predecessor, immediate predecessor of telenovelas, or Mexican soap operas. And so he appeared in radio programs in the early 60s, in 1963, and he's a mystical character. I'll describe him in a moment. But he was so popular on the radio that within a year or two, they started putting out a comic based on Kaliman. And he was so popular that in the 1970s, at the height of his popularity, that some scholars have calculated that there were about 3 million copies a week of Kaliman being published every week for years. So an extraordinary character that lives both on the radio and in comic books. And yet another example of how, when we talk about comic books, we're talking about mass culture and mass media, and really it's so implicated with other forms of culture that we can't separate them. Now, who is Kaliman? Well, that is the question. And the Mexicans and Mexican Americans here and scholars who've spent time in Mexico know that that's part of the pleasure of Kaliman. He's a beautiful, muscular man of indeterminate ethnicity, but with pretty white skin, blue eyes. He wears a milk white costume and turban with this jewel brooch on the front. He's oriental and mysterious, but not too oriental, you know, because that would be a little bit disturbing, possibly. He has great speed, extraordinary vision, superhuman stamina. He has an extraordinary mind. He can speak to animals. He's a hypnotist. He's a mesmerist. He has ESP. And he belongs to a group of men protected by the Hindu goddess of Kali. And he dedicates his life to the pursuit of justice. Now, his name is a fusion of Kali and also the suffix man, because the creators were into Superman, and so they felt like they needed man in the name. And he had one other thing in common with Superman, is he was an orphan. He was raised by Tibetan lamas with secret extraterrestrial knowledge, and his sidekick, the Robin to his Batman, if you will, was Solin, an Egyptian youngster descended from the pharaohs. Okay? And I want to share with you some images of Kaliman. They made a movie, 2 movies about Kaliman. The first one, starring Jeff Cooper, and he spoke his lines in English, and then they went back and dubbed it in Spanish on top. This, I don't know if they ever did this in that famous TV series, Mystery Science Theater 3000 or 2000. I don't know if you know that program, where they would show a movie that's very campy, and then you've got some robots in the front row making smart alecky comments about the movie. I don't know if they ever showed this movie, but they should have. It would have been the most popular movie ever on that program. And so it's a very campy movie, and at that time it was the most expensive movie ever made in the history of Mexico. And the Mexican film industry was the most powerful, the most affluent, the most productive of any movie industry in all of South America. And in 1972, I don't have the figures, but it was the most expensive movie made up to that time. Now, Kaliman has an ideology, one that is promoted in his comics. He says that, you know, over and over again we learn that the human mind is limitlessly powerful and influential as long as it is properly trained and used in a disciplined manner. He also believes in nonviolence, patience, and endurance. In a way, he's an inspiring model for people who might come from disadvantaged backgrounds. He's a kind of promotes self-reliance. And so, in a way, there's a kind of self-help dimension to Kaliman, which might explain the reason why he might have caught on among the Mexican people, because he's an inspiring, motivating figure, in spite of being an orphan, in spite of not having parents, etc. Most of his adventures take place in faraway exotic lands, such as the Far East or Middle East. So there's no Mexican setting, and yet it's wildly popular. That's another question we want to answer and explore. His foes are vampires, robots, zombies, monsters, and criminal superminds of every imaginable stripe. It's definitely a fantasy comic. And he has one recurring arch enemy, the Moriarty to his Sherlock Holmes, and that is the Black Spider, who always gets away at the end and comes back. And the Black Spider is a businessman who dresses in black and wears a mask over his face. So the question that I think some of us might be thinking about right now is, what is so Mexican about Kaliman, or why might Kaliman appeal to the Mexican people? You know, in spite of all of that, all of his exotic trappings and his foreignness. I mean, what is it about Kaliman that might be tuning in to the Mexican psyche? Well, I have some suggestions. I don't work on Kaliman. I'm interested because I'm passionate about this subject, but I want to give you some ideas that other scholars have floated and which I think are persuasive. So we've got this issue of faraway exotic lands. The territories that Kaliman usually inhabits are not urban, not developed. And so one way of thinking about this is in terms of nostalgia for tradition or for the non-urban space. Right at the moment that cities are exploding and telenovelas and radionovelas are exploring this transition from the countryside to the city, we've got a comic book set in definitely a non-urban landscape that is appealing to a huge number of Mexicans. And so one way of thinking about this is in terms of nostalgia, in terms of the appeal of getting away from the city, the symbol of progress, of modernization, which is rather alienating, right? And so there's this kind of exotic appeal of this fantasy realm, which is less developed. So there is another aspect to this, which would be the black spider. Because he's a man of business with a large network of collaborators and henchmen, dresses in a suit and wears a mask and a hat, we might think of him, right, in terms of capitalism, in terms of progress, in terms of this kind of modern ethos. Now, I feel a little bit uncomfortable doing this kind of allegorical reading because sometimes we force these kinds of interpretations on comic books. We shouldn't underestimate the sheer pleasure of something that's just campy, fun, adventurous, or simply something accidental and that is used perhaps in many other comics and which is inherited in a particular comic we're analyzing. So, so we've got the black spider, we've got the faraway exotic lands, and we've got the ideology of Kaliman, where Kaliman is definitely a character who is idealistic, an anti-materialist. And there is a very strong of idealism, transcendental idealism in Mexican intellectual history and in Latin American intellectual history writ large. This idea that the Latin American identity or Mexican identity embodies a spiritual principle that is anathema to Anglo-Saxon modern life or to Anglo-Saxon modern technology and culture. And this is something we see beginning to emerge at the end of the 19th century through writers like José Martí, who was Cuban, not Mexican, but very famous and influential, and later in a very important author called José Vasconcelos, who wrote a book called The Cosmic Race, in which he celebrated mestizaje as this kind of mestizaje as a chosen race or a magical process by which the Mexican people acquire greatness in comparison to other pure races, including the Anglo-Saxon race, and many other statements about how Latin America and Mexico, talks back or represents an alternative to U.S. identity and U.S. culture. And so I think those are some ideas that we might bring to the table to think about this question. I wanted to talk about Mexi-Westerns, Mexican comic books that take place in the U.S. West, but I want to be sure to give all of you some time to ask some questions. So I'll simply power through some images from the rest of my presentation and wrap it up in a minute. This is what I'm working on right now as a scholar. I'm working on Mexi-Westerns. We've heard of spaghetti westerns. They're not all terrible, spaghetti westerns, although they all seem terrible at first glance. So we've got spaghetti westerns, the Italian westerns. We've got, and some of you might not know this, paella westerns, Spanish westerns, some of which are equally as disconcerting as spaghetti westerns. And I recently learned the term Mexi-Western. Westerns are very popular in Mexico. It's something that seems counterintuitive, but there are many examples of U.S. Comic book characters being popular in Mexico. Have Gun Will Travel, one of the most popular TV shows from the 1950s. And then we've got Mexican versions of Westerns where Mexican artists start to mix and experiment with the Western formula to introduce Mexican elements in it. And then we have movies about the Mexican Revolution, which incorporate elements of U.S. Westerns as well. So I would argue that some of the popular movies about Pancho Villa have a kind of Western flair about them. the comic books in Mexico will frequently use pseudonyms, U.S.-sounding pseudonyms, so that readers can have the pretense that they're reading a comic book written by a North American. But that's a pseudonym, Billy Flynn, and they're written by Mexicans. And so one of the most popular themes of these comic books is captivity narratives. And scholars like to talk about, and I agree with this, and this is what I'm interested in as well, is the ways in which these comic books meditate on the immigration experience, and how these comic books are a way to think through the experience of crossing the border and interacting with U.S. culture in a highly mediated and allegorical way. So that's it. Thank you for listening, and I'd like to give you an opportunity to ask some questions. Thank you.
Now I'll be taking questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and either myself or Pippa will come to you with a microphone.
One of the early comics had a part on it where it said that it was for people over 15 years of age. And I was wondering what kind of material was considered for adults.
Yeah, when comics started appearing in the comic books appearing in the 1930s, there was this, even though they were read by adults and kids, there was still this reputation that it was for kids. And one of the mastheads of one of these comic book digests said something along the lines of the most popular comic books for kids. But then by the 1940s, in that same comic book, the masthead then read the most popular comic book for adults of all ages, or like what you said. And so by the 1940s, it's been established very clearly that comic books are for everybody and primarily for adults. So that's one thing that I wanted to say. The other thing I wanted to say is that the issue of what was appropriate to represent in comic books is a very vexed one in the 1950s in Mexico. And there was extraordinary controversy in Mexico in that period with the church and different groups, organizations promoting morality. They had these campaigns to lobby the government to banish comics or to censor comics. And as a result, the Mexican government started to create a commission, a government agency that would regulate comics and make sure that nothing indecent was represented in them. And this is very similar to what happened in the United States. It happened a little bit later with the Comic Book Authority Code. And for many years, up until the 1970s, superhero comics and all comics would have a little stamp in the corner that said approved by the Comic Book Authority of something by that nature. And so this is a big thing, and they were very risque in the 1950s and 1960s. And in the 1970s, a lot of pornography started, overt pornography started being published in Mexico. And when those magazines were squashed, they would reappear under a different title. And so at this point, there's a lot of porn. In the last 30 years, there's been a tremendous amount of comic book porn on the Mexican market. But even the comic books that are not pornographic are somewhat pornographic. My students think so, at least. We're reading comic books that are not considered to be pornographic, but they consider it pornographic in their representation. So.
Hi, Professor Conway. Thank you so much for your talk. That was really interesting. I have a question for you relating to the role of women in Mexican comics. Because from the images that you showed, I think the protagonists were overwhelmingly male, whereas the females were often cast in roles like damsels in distress and whatnot. So I was just wondering if there has been any kind of evolution in the role of women throughout the years in Mexican comics.
Yes, and that's a great question. And so I picked 3 iconic comic book characters or series to talk to you about. And I had to exclude a lot of things, and it was very painful. Think if you had to introduce, if you were going to Mexico and you had to introduce U.S. comics, how, you would talk about Peanuts maybe, but what about Calvin and Hobbes? What about Superman? Would you do Marvel or would you do DC? Would you do both? And what about Garfield? If you leave Garfield out, what happens, right? And anyway, so so I left a lot of stuff out, and one of the things I left out is in the 1940s there were two types of women characters in comic books. The stay-at-home, traditional, submissive, if you will, young lady or mother, and then a construct called La Chica Moderna, or the modern girl. And the modern girl comics were popular in the 40s and early 50s, and they had protagonists that were women that were adventure tales and swashbuckling stories. And one of the most famous was called Adelita y las Guerrillas, and it ran for a long time and tremendously popular and influential. And so La Chica Moderna comics was something that really upset the Catholic Church and more conservative groups. And they were more in favor of the more conservative, iconic figure of the kind of stay-at-home mother. And then women often appear, especially beginning in the 60s and particularly in the 1970s, as objects. And I think that cover of the Apache holding the woman, that's very typical of El Libro Vaquero. You always have a woman, you know, barely clothed on the cover, and she's in the foreground and the cowboy's in the background. She always has to be in the foreground. So, so that becomes very common, increasingly common in the 1970s.
And like to what degree they became propaganda, or how much, especially with the Mexican censorship, if that was an issue?
Excellent. That's a great question. Yes, Mexican comic books were used by every ideology. So the Catholic Church and more right-wing groups early on in the late 1930s and early 1940s got into comics and started publishing comics that were intended for young readers, but the subject matter was very adult. And so, for example, one of the most famous incidents of the Mexican Revolution, or periods of the Mexican Revolution, is the Cristero War, when it's basically an uprising created by a popular uprising created by the policies of the revolutionary state against the church. And so we have this uprising called the Cristero Revolt, and so more conservative right-wing comic books would present histories of the Mexican Revolution shortly after the revolution had finished, in which they retold the story of the Cristero Revolt from a Catholic and right-wing perspective. And they would make fun of the revolutionary leaders and government members of the government as frauds and hypocrites, and they would really attack those groups. And then we had very left-wing comic books that were being produced by unions and organizations that were much more almost Marxist in orientation, in which they promoted basically socialism through comic book storytelling. And then we've got more mainstream comic books that tell the story of the past of Mexico, such as the Conquest, or La Virgen de Guadalupe, or the Mexican Revolution, from a kind of generic, middle-of-the-road, we're all Mexicans, can't we all just get along and love each other, we're the greatest people on earth kind of attitude, kind of a real state-sponsored nationalism kind of point of view. So you've got every single ideology there, you know, pushing an agenda. And yes, I think you could call it propaganda to some degree, but I think, you know, all comics have an ideology, all representation has an ideology. So, you know, it really depends how you define propaganda. One of the comic books I have in my collection that I'm proudest of is an overt propagandistic comic book from the early 1970s against communism. And there it's just in your face. They don't even bother trying to tell a story or do anything. It's all taken out of a textbook of why, you know, communism is evil and we must exterminate the communists. And this was in a very terrible, destructive period of Mexican history, right after the massacre of hundreds of students in 1968 in Mexico City. And so it's a really interesting comic book.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. Really appreciated it.
Thank you.
Question that I have is relating to what you mentioned about the intermedia kind of relation of comics. You talked about how they relate to radios and telenovelas, and I was wondering if you see any parallel between that and now U.S. mainstream comic book media, where, you know, things like Marvel and not just the comic Marvel, but the movie Marvel, you know,
Yeah.
the TV Marvel,
Yeah.
now starting to become part of social media in general. So
Yeah.
do you see any parallels in that sense?
Yeah, I definitely do. Thank you for that question. I definitely do, and that goes back to the 1940s and 1950s. I mean, my dad and my brother grew up watching The Lone Ranger on TV and watching Lone Ranger movies and reading Lone Ranger comics, and the same thing with Roy Rogers. And so we see there a real confluence of television, film, and comic books. And the same thing happens in Mexico. And obviously, we've had Batman, for example, Batman movies and serials since the I don't mean breakfast cereals, but you know, those movies that were really from the 1930s and 1940s, excuse me, that really cheaply produced, and there would be 500 episodes. We've had those since the 1940s that they're not very well known. We know the famous 1960s Batman TV show with Adam West, but we're less familiar with the earlier versions. So that's just a kind of a really universal thing, but I think we're in a period right now when that's really exploding. What I don't really see right now is a strong presence on TV. I don't particularly care for Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. or what Peggy Carter agent of, well, I forget what the title is, but because it's the same thing with a lot of sci-fi programs where, you know, the cheap sci-fi programs where there are no extraterrestrials or spaceships, right? Everything happens in a world that looks just like ours, but it's sci-fi for some reason. I think they're talking about making an X-Men TV series. Maybe there'll be actual superheroes in it, in which case we'll start to see people dressed up as superheroes on TV. But there's been a resistance on TV to show that. I mean, Smallville never showed, or maybe I stopped watching by the last season, so I missed the last season. But I don't think we ever saw him dress up, right? Did we, as in Smallville? Did he ever wear the costume at the end? The last episode? Okay, I'll have to look that up. But really, I mean, talk about 8 years of waiting to see that happen, right? And now we've got Gotham, right? And in Gotham, we're not going to see Batman ever in Gotham, right? So I don't know why I'm going down this road, but I apologize. But I think what's missing right now is that TV presence that we had with the Western in the 1950s and 1960s in Mexico and the United States. And by the way, the TV Westerns were hugely influential throughout Latin America. This is something that's not really talked about and what I'm really passionate about studying right now. But thank you for that question.
Okay, thank you for your interesting speech. So earlier on, hello. Earlier, when you were talking about the controversial comic book about telling people how to cross the border, you said it was packaged with 2 other comic books. One that was directed towards like a female audience, and one
Yes.
that was directed towards a male audience. Could you elaborate on that and give like other examples of how like there are different types of comic books and how they're targeted to different
Oh, wonderful,
demographics?
yeah, sure. Yeah, the diversity of comic books is really pretty amazing. So we've got Western comic books. I've talked about those. We've got biographies of famous historical characters, and I've talked about that in terms of state nationalism. We've got, I'm a little bit uncomfortable talking about it here, but there's a lot of pornography. There are a lot of snuff comics, which are, you know, basically depict torture, and it's a combination of torture and porn. It's really rather extraordinary, and that is tied in with what is called nowadays narcocultura, narco culture. This fascination with the drug wars in Mexico, and there's a whole culture that has arisen around and through what's been happening in Mexico with the current drug wars. And in music, for example, a lot of ballads, murder ballads about famous narcos, and a lot of even, you know, a syncretic, you know, we've got the Cult of Santa Muerte, which some people think is exclusively associated with drug gangs and with murderers, and which other people believe is a broader phenomenon, and which, you know, has been tarnished by its association with narcocultura. But definitely, narcocultura has as one of its manifestations, I would argue, some of these snuff comics that are just super violent and vilely disgusting comics, which I've never cracked one, I'm proud to say, but unfortunately I've seen some of the covers, and as I'm searching as a collector for comics. So that would be another type of comics. Then you've got satirical comics, things like Mad Magazine or Cracked Magazine, where we've got more caricature. The art is more like a caricature, and it's making fun of politicians and what's happening in Mexico at that given moment. They're one of the most famous comic book artists to ever emerge in the 20th century, and out of Mexico is a man called Rius. And Rius is famous worldwide for writing a book called Marx for Beginners, which is a comic book introduction to Marx. And that was so popular that now we've got Freud for beginners, we've got Heidegger for beginners, we've got all of these books, right? And Rius, coming from a far left perspective in the 1970s, participated in several satirical magazines that were politically oriented. And so that's, a popular type of Mexican comic book as well. And then you've got, things that would be like Garfield or like Calvin and Hobbes, comics that are just fun and accessible for younger readers, something like La Familia Burrón. So something light and fun. It's not, an adventure story or anything of that nature. So those are some that come to mind right this minute. There's some sci-fi, but not as much as you might expect. In terms of superheroes, we've got El Santo, the masked wrestler. That was extremely popular for many decades. Those comics are very hard to get because anything related to wrestling, in terms of collecting wrestling items, it's been popular for 20 or 30 years now. And if you're interested in collecting things, I always recommend find something that people are not interested in collecting. 10 years later, it will be. And you'll have a great collection of whatever it is.
This is the last question we'll have time for.
Thank you, Professor, for your talk. It was very interesting. In Professor Skinner's class, we talk a lot about identity and culture in Latin America and how Latin Americans build that identity and how they look at themselves in their context. So what I wanted to ask you was, sorry, give me 1 second. You talked about the influence of American mass media and society on Mexican and Latin American comics and identity. So how important do you think that influence is today to how Latin Americans identify themselves?
Wow, yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure I can answer it correctly. I think that U.S. culture since the 1930s has exerted extraordinary influence on Latin America. In the 19th century, it was European culture that really influenced the dominant culture. And in the beginning in the 20th century, it's U.S. culture, particularly through television and film. I think today I visited a class and I spoke about an experience that really upset me when I was writing my dissertation in the 90s and I was visiting Caracas, Venezuela to do research on Simón Bolívar. And I saw a sign for McDonald's with the yellow arches, and on the bottom was a quote from Simón Bolívar. And for me, that was deeply offensive because even though I'm not Venezuelan, the association of such an important historical figure with the golden arches just seemed wrong. And so there's a lot of that, no doubt. But the other thing that I said in the class, one of the classes I visited today, is we should not underestimate the creative power of Latin American culture. Latin American culture is not passive. It's not a receptor culture. It's a culture that exports and produces. And I'll just leave you with one example, and there are many more examples. But telenovelas have been so popular that they've been exported throughout the developing world, to Africa, to Francophone Caribbean, throughout other Latin American countries, and to the former Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union dissolved and after the fall of the wall, the entertainment industry in Eastern Europe was in a real jam because the mass media was so directed towards ideological indoctrination that they didn't have too much experience with entertainment. And wouldn't you know, there were some Mexicans there offering a package of telenovelas for a pretty good price. And so what happened shortly after the big change in the 1990s in Russia was a boom in Latin American telenovelas, with all of those Russian grannies sitting there watching Mexican lovers speak in Russian and chase each other across the TV screen back and forth. And I had a student present at a conference at my university, and she talked about telenovelas, and there was a gentleman in the audience. Originally we thought he was African American, but he stood up and he said, "My name is so-and-so, I'm from Nigeria, and that telenovela you spoke about, I grew up watching that in Lagos." And so I just want to say that Latin America is victimized, if you want to use that word, or is the object of cultural penetration, but it also fights back, it speaks back, and it's such a rich culture that it has populated the world and our U.S. culture with tremendous artists and TV programs and characters, if you will. So I think there's a positive spin to it as well. But I think it's a major factor in culture, the power of all of these Marvel movies and all of these TV shows in south of the border. Thank you for your question, and thank you to all of you. I appreciate your interest and questions.